Ben checks his savings app the way he does most Sunday mornings, coffee in hand, half paying attention. Emergency fund, $11,200. He feels that specific, quiet kind of secure, covered, responsible. Ahead of the curve, honestly, compared to most people his age. Now let's do something Ben hasn't done in about 2 years. Let's actually look at what's gone in and out of that account. March, $800. Flight home for a college friend's wedding. June, $600. A couch. That was, in his words at the time, basically falling apart, even though it wasn't. September, $400. A car. Repair that had been on a maintenance list for 3 months before it became urgent. December, a laptop, because his old one was probably going to die soon. None of these were emergencies. All of them came out of the emergency fund. Here's the part nobody says out loud about emergency funds. Having one doesn't automatically protect you from anything, because the account doesn't enforce its own rules. You do. And most people, once the balance exists, quietly start renegotiating what counts as an emergency until the word stops meaning anything at all. This isn't a video telling you not to have an emergency fund. It's a video about a trap, one so well disguised that the fund itself gets blamed for going empty, when actually nothing about the fund ever failed. My name is Alex, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time looking at where people's money quietly vanishes to. If you've ever opened your emergency fund and had to think for a second about whether that balance is actually still intact, hit subscribe, because today on Wealth Adjacent, we're taking apart the account you did everything right to build and still somehow lost track of. Before we go further, a quick disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, and I am absolutely not telling anyone that building an emergency fund was a mistake. It wasn't. Having one puts you ahead of a huge share of people who have nothing at all. What I am here to do is run the actual numbers on what happens to that fund after the day you finish building it, because that's the part nobody makes a video celebrating. Let's introduce someone. Ben, early 30s, works in logistics, built a genuinely solid emergency fund over about 18 months of real discipline. He's not careless. He didn't blow through it in one reckless weekend. There's no single moment you could point to and say, there, that's when it went wrong. That's exactly what makes this trap so effective. There's no dramatic failure to notice, just a slow, reasonable-sounding drift. Let's start with the number, because it is genuinely a little unhinged. Multiple surveys on emergency savings find that a large majority of people who have a dedicated emergency fund report using it for something that, on reflection, wasn't actually an emergency within the past 12 months. Let me say that again. Most emergency funds aren't failing because people don't have one. They're failing because the definition of emergency quietly expands until almost anything qualifies. Where does that expansion actually come from? A large share of withdrawals get justified as technically necessary: a car repair, an appliance replacement, something that is, in a literal sense, a real cost, just not an unpatchimpenturin. Another meaningful chunk comes from irregular annual expenses, an insurance premium, a holiday travel cost, something that happens every year on a predictable schedule, but still gets treated as a surprise because nobody budgeted for it separately. And the rest comes from a simple human D-Day impulse. The money is sitting right there, clearly available. And in the moment, available money is remarkably good at feeling like permission. And here's the part that should make you sit up. This isn't a discipline problem in the way people assume. Research on labeled savings accounts consistently finds that once money is placed in a named, purpose-built account, people become measurably more willing to spend from it for things loosely adjacent to that purpose, compared to spending the exact same amount from an unlabeled checking account. The label itself changes the psychology. Naming an account emergency fund doesn't just protect the money, it also, quietly, gives every borderline expense a built-in justification to draw from it. But having an emergency fund isn't the trap. A cushion is just a cushion. Here's where it becomes a trap. A significant share of people who've withdrawn from their fund for a non-emergency report they never replenished it, or took more than 6 months to do so. meaning the fund sat underprotected for an extended stretch without anyone consciously deciding that was acceptable. And the genuinely uncomfortable stat sitting right next to it. A notable share of people say they've had an actual emergency arrive while their fund was still partially depleted from a previous non-emergency withdrawal. Read that twice. The fund failed at its actual job, not because it was too small to begin with, but because it had already been spent down on things that were never emergencies in the first place. Back to Ben. Over about 2 years, 4 withdrawals, the wedding flight, the couch, the car repair, the laptop, totaling roughly $2,200, came out of his fund. He always meant to put it back. He never set an actual date to do it, which meant it just didn't happen, quietly, the same way the withdrawals themselves happened quietly. When his actual car transmission failed 8 months later, a real, unpredictable, expensive emergency, his fund was $2,000 lighter than it should have been. And he ended up financing part of the repair on a card at 19% interest, the exact outcome the fund existed to prevent in the first place. He is not the exception. Most people who experience a genuine financial emergency after previously dipping into their fund for non-emergencies report the fund covered meaningfully less of the actual crisis than they'd assumed it would, precisely because they hadn't tracked how much of it was already quietly gone. Now here's the part that turns this from a spending problem into a psychology problem. And this is the part that should genuinely fascinate you once you see it clearly. Behavioral economists call this mental accounting, the tendency to treat money differently depending on which mental bucket it's assigned to, even though a dollar is a dollar regardless of which account it sits in. An emergency fund is supposed to be the most protected bucket of all. But mental accounting cuts both ways. The same labeling that makes people reluctant to touch a vacation fund for groceries also, counterintuitively, makes an emergency fund feel like the responsible place to pull from, because at least it's not going on a credit card. At least it's money I already saved, which feels virtuous even when the withdrawal itself isn't remotely urgent. A researcher studying this exact pattern found something almost too honest. People frequently justify a non-emergency withdrawal specifically because it feels more responsible than the alternative, financing the same purchase without ever asking the more basic question of whether the purchase needed to happen on that timeline at all. You didn't decide the couch was an emergency. You decided pulling from savings was more responsible than a credit card. And then let that reasonable-sounding logic quietly answer a completely different question. And then there's the specific mechanism that makes emergency fund erosion so hard to notice. Nobody drains the account in one sitting. Each individual withdrawal is small relative to the total balance, a few $100s against several thousand, so no single withdrawal ever feels like it meaningfully compromises the fund's purpose. That's precisely what makes the pattern so easy to repeat. No single withdrawal ever crosses a visible line, because the line was never actually drawn in the first place. Now, before we go further, we still haven't gotten to the single most common reclassification of them all. The one that happens so smoothly, most people don't even notice they've done it. Hold that thought, because first, the smaller leaks. Let's talk about the phrase that should trigger alarm bells the moment it shows up in your own head. Well, it's technically necessary. A car repair is technically necessary. So is a new phone eventually. So is almost every purchase a reasonably careful adult makes. Necessary was never the actual bar for an emergency. Unpredictable and urgent were. Multiple studies on personal finance behavior find that people substitute necessary for urgent specifically because it's a much easier bar to clear, and clearing it feels the same in the moment, even though it describes a completely different category of expense. Then there's the predictable but annual trap. An expense that happens every single year. Car insurance, a holiday flight, a annual medical deductible, but still gets treated as a shock each time it arrives because it wasn't specifically budgeted for outside the emergency fund. An expense you can see coming a full year in advance is not, by any reasonable definition, an emergency. It's a planning gap, wearing an emergency's clothing. There's a social version of this pattern too. A wedding, a funeral, a friend's milestone event. These carry real emotional weight, and declining to attend for financial reasons can feel almost unthinkable in the moment. That social pressure is genuinely powerful, and it's worth naming directly because "I couldn't say no" is a completely different justification than "this was unpredictable," even though both frequently get filed under the exact same withdrawal. And then, the single most common reclassification of them all, the "I'll replace it later" promise, made sincerely, in the moment, with genuine intention, and then quietly abandoned the moment the immediate need passes and there's no external deadline forcing the replenishment to actually happen. Research on savings, replenishment finds that withdrawals without an automatic, scheduled repayment plan get replaced significantly less often and significantly more slowly than withdrawals tied to an automatic transfer set up the same day the money leaves the account. Intention without a mechanism is, statistically, close to the same as no intention at all. There's a timing version of this trap too, one that shows up specifically around predictable calendar moments. Holiday season is the single most common window for emergency fund withdrawals that have nothing to do with actual emergencies, gifts, travel, hosting costs, all real expenses, none of them remotely unpredictable, all arriving at the exact same time every single year. Multiple surveys on holiday spending find a meaningful share of people specifically plan to use savings, including emergency savings, to cover costs they already know are coming months in advance. An expense you can circle on a calendar a full year ahead of time has by definition already failed the unpredictability test before it even happens. All right, here's the section nobody wants anywhere near a calculator when a small withdrawal feels harmless. Let's do this through Ben, because abstract numbers slide right off the brain. Say instead of those 4 withdrawals totaling $2,200 sitting unreplenished for 2 years, Ben had either left the money untouched or replenished it within 30 days each time. His fund would have been fully intact when the transmission failed, covering the entire repair in cash. Instead, the gap forced roughly $1,800 onto a card at 19% interest, which took 14 months to pay off and cost an additional $200 in interest on top of the original amount. The $2,200 in non-emergency withdrawals didn't just cost $2,200. It cost that, plus the interest on the emergency it failed to fully cover, plus over a year of carrying a balance that a properly maintained fund would have made completely unnecessary. Here's the framework I want you to carry around. The real cost of a non-emergency withdrawal isn't the amount you take out. It's the gap that amount leaves exposed the next time something genuinely urgent happens, multiplied by whatever it costs you to cover that gap a different way. A $400 emergency for a purchase that isn't urgent isn't a $400 decision. It's a bet that nothing real happens before you get around to replacing it. And that bet doesn't always pay off. It's worth sitting with that for a second because it's a genuinely different shape of trap than most of what this channel usually covers. This isn't about a purchase that was obviously excessive. Every individual withdrawal in Ben's case was reasonable sounding on its own. The problem was never any single decision. It was the complete absence of a rule distinguishing urgent and unpredictable from necessary and inconvenient, which meant every withdrawal got to write its own definition in the moment it happened. And now here's where it gets almost cruel. If treating the fund flexibly, reliably made people more financially resilient, you could defend the pattern. It doesn't, particularly. Research comparing households with strict versus flexible emergency fund rules finds the strict rule households recover from genuine financial shocks meaningfully faster, not because they have more money overall, but because the fund is actually there, at full strength, the moment it's needed, instead of partially hollowed out by a year of reasonable-sounding exceptions. Now, let me keep my promise, because I am not telling anyone that every one of those withdrawals was wrong. I can already hear the objections, because I get them every time I make a video like this. First, but some of those were genuinely real needs, not just impulse spending. Fair point, and often true. A car repair genuinely needs to happen. But notice the actual question worth asking isn't whether the expense was real. It's whether it was unpredictable enough that you couldn't have planned for it through a different, dedicated savings category instead of your emergency reserve specifically. Second, but tracking every dollar and setting up separate funds for every category feels like overkill for normal life. Also fair, and the answer isn't dozens of micro accounts, it's one additional category, sometimes called a life happens fund, sitting clearly separate from the true emergency reserve, specifically sized for the predictable but irregular expenses that aren't actually emergencies but also aren't discretionary spending. The actual answer was never touch your savings for anything but a catastrophe. It's no, before the moment arrives, which bucket a given expense is actually supposed to come from. There's a third objection worth naming honestly too, but having a rigid rule feels stressful. Part of why I built the fund was to stop obsessing over every dollar. That's a completely fair concern, and the two-question test actually solves it rather than making it worse, because a clear rule removes the in-the-moment negotiation entirely. You're not deciding whether each expense qualifies from scratch every time. You're running the same 15-second test and trusting the answer, which is actually less mentally taxing than relitigating the definition of emergency every few months. So here's the framework I'd actually use. I call it the two-question test, and you can run it on any withdrawal in under 15 seconds. Question 1. Could I have reasonably predicted this expense existed, even roughly, more than a month in advance? If yes, it belongs in a planned category, not the emergency fund, regardless of how real or necessary it is. Question 2. If I do nothing about this for 30 days, does something genuinely bad happen, financially, physically, or otherwise? If the honest answer is no, it can wait for a planned category, too, even if it feels urgent in the moment. A few practical moves fall out of that. Set up a separate Life Happens fund alongside the True Emergency Fund, sized around 1 to 2 months of predictable irregular expenses, insurance premiums, annual fees, the once-a-year costs that aren't emergencies but also aren't optional. Whenever you do withdraw from the actual emergency fund, set the replenishment transfer up automatically that same day, not as an intention, as a standing instruction, because intention without a mechanism reliably fails. And once a year, actually look at what left the emergency fund over the past 12 months, the way we just did with Ben, because most people have literally never done this once. So here's where we land. The emergency fund trap isn't a story about anyone being irresponsible with money. It's a story about a genuinely good habit, having a cushion at all, getting quietly undermined by the absence of a clear definition for the one word the entire account is built around. The data doesn't say emergency funds don't work. What it says is quieter and far more useful. An emergency fund with a clear rule about what actually qualifies, and an automatic system for replenishing it, tends to actually be there when a real emergency arrives, in a way that a flexibly defined fund frequently isn't, even when the total dollars saved look identical on paper. And if you're Ben right now, looking at your own balance and doing the same uncomfortable math, hear this clearly. You're not bad with money. You did the hard part. You actually built the fund, which puts you ahead of most people just by existing. You ran into a definitional gap almost nobody thinks to close, because nobody ever hands you a clear rule for what emergency actually means when you set the account up in the first place. Of course it drifted a little. It was never given a boundary. Seeing that clearly is most of the battle. So Ben sets the two-question test as his actual rule going forward, writes it down, genuinely, not just as a mental note. He opens a small separate fund for the predictable annual stuff, sized at about $1,500, and sets an automatic same-day replenishment transfer for anything that does come out of the real emergency fund. The fund doesn't get bigger overnight. It just finally has an actual boundary, the one thing it was missing the entire time. Spend from the fund that's actually meant for the moment you're in. Skip the quiet reclassification that was never really about the expense at all. And protect the boundary, because the next genuine emergency doesn't check whether your fund has been quietly hollowed out by a year of reasonable-sounding exceptions before it decides to show up. And the next time you're about to pull from an account labeled emergency, pause for the 15 seconds the two-question test actually takes, because the account was never the problem. The missing definition was. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the most technically necessary thing you've ever pulled from your emergency fund? I'll see you in the next one.